Good morning, those of you who have already joined us. Thank you so much for doing so. We're just going to give it 1 or 2 minutes for the number of attendees to level out before we officially start. Hello again to those of you who've joined since I spoke a minute or so ago. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We are going to give it another 30 seconds for the number of attendees to level up. It's still increasing quite quickly, and then we will commence. Okay. Good. Sorry, I keep saying good morning. It's very much good afternoon. Hi, I am Tracy Davies. I am the Executive Director of Just Share, which is a non-profit shareholder activism NGO. And Just Share and WWF and MBI have been working on a program on sustainable finance for the last approximately 2 years, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're really excited about the conversation that we're going to be having today. Just a couple of kind of housekeeping issues. We will certainly finish on time at 1:30. We have kept the chat function open for you to use to chat to other people in the room, because we're very conscious of the fact that while we have a very impressive panel of experts, there are also a lot of impressive experts in our audience. So please do feel free to chat to each other in the chat function. However, for the purposes of questions to panelists, please confine those to the Q&A section so that we can keep track of those, because it's very difficult to try and wheedle out the questions from the chat if there's a lot of chat going on. And then at the intervals that we've left for Q&A, we'll work through your questions. So we do, as I say, have 90 minutes, and we will try to get in as many of those questions as possible. We're going to start with a little bit of a general discussion on the transition of the transport sector, and then we'll stop to answer any questions at that point, at a point after that discussion. So please do, you can start adding Q&A as quickly as you want. And then we'll get into the more technical aspects of the conversation in the second half of the webinar, and then have another Q&A session at the end. So as I said, this is a joint project. This webinar and the report that we will be speaking about in this webinar are the result of a joint project with WWF and NBI that aims to build the capacity of the South African financial services sector to better understand and integrate climate risk into decision-making in ways that drive climate action forward. A lot of the work that we've done in this project, and as I say, it spanned the last couple of years, is represented and displayed in all sorts of what we think are quite impressive ways on our website. The website will be put into the chat for you to be able to have a look at. But the main outputs of this project are 3 sector reports, one on electricity, one on agriculture, and one on transport, which the final report will be launched very imminently. We decided to focus on transport. We had obviously many sectors that we could have focused on in addition to electricity and agriculture, because it was highlighted to us quite early on in this project how crucial the transport sector is in just transition discussions, but also how little attention it has received in South Africa in the context of climate change and the just transition. It really is a critical element of our transition to a low carbon future. And I think probably those of you, most of you who have joined us this morning will be aware that part of this is possibly just because we're so much more aware of the transport sector and what's happening in it than we were before, but there is a lot of stuff happening at the moment. In fact, October is Transport Month. The Department of Transport officially launched the Transport Month at the beginning of the month, declaring that the DOT will be focusing on rail transport. NAAMS's South African Auto Week is taking place later in the month, focusing crucially on the future of the automotive industry. And there is a Smarter Mobility Africa Summit, which starts tomorrow. So the transport sector accounts for 11% of South Africa's total emissions. 91% of those are from road transport. It is a prime sector for decarbonisation because of the lower alternative technology costs, but also because in the South African context, decarbonising the transport sector can form part of a much broader, should form part of a much broader aim and campaign to redress other imbalances in our society related to our history, related to infrastructure challenges that we have at the moment, particularly overutilization of roads and underutilization and ineffectiveness of public transport, and the underutilization of rail for freight. We can already see the effects of climate change on the sector, both physical effects and looming very largely on the horizon transition effects. The KwaZulu-Natal floods are a very specific and extreme example of how the transport sector in multiple ways is susceptible to climate impacts, not just because of the damage to the road, to ports, the impacts on road freight and logistics and supply chains, the fact that the Toyota South Africa factory had to close down for a number of months, impacting workers and their employment and their income. But also from a transition point of view, the fact that the whole world is transitioning to a low carbon economy is going to have severe impacts on our own automotive sector, whether we like it or not. We focus to an almost obsessive degree in South Africa on the impacts that a just transition to a low carbon economy will have on coal workers, but very little to the impacts that a just transition will have on all sorts of other sectors of our economy. In fact, the impacts that it is already having. There are approximately 110,000 people directly employed by the automotive sector in South Africa. That compares to around about 95,000 people directly employed by the coal sector, is a very significant employer. At the moment, all of the cars that we make in South Africa, as I'm sure most of you will know, are internal combustion engine cars, vehicles, not just cars, vehicles. And our main export market, the European Union, has indicated that it will ban the sale of ICE vehicles within the next 8 to 10 years, depending on the country involved. So here we have an extremely imminent and extremely serious risk to a very important sector of our economy that is not receiving nearly sufficient attention in terms of how quickly and how dramatically we need to transition it. You may have seen there was an article in the Business Day this morning saying precisely this, that South Africa is falling behind on the urgent need to transition our automotive sector. The Presidential Climate Commission has developed a just transition framework, which has been approved by Cabinet. In the framework, one of the things that it does is envisaging working with the Department of Transport on a number of aspects relating to the sector, including identifying affected workers and small businesses, focusing on taxi owners and drivers, rail operators, mechanics and petrol stations, and on a significant shift of passenger transport from road to rail. The Just Energy Transition Partnership, the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, has also, as one of its 5 working groups, set up a working group focusing on the transport sector. So hopefully the importance and the urgency of transitioning this sector is starting to be more widely recognized. We hope to contribute to this morning with this discussion. We look forward to discussing this both with our expert panelists and with the experts in the audience. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to our speakers, and then I will hand over to Dave Collins. Farai Chireshe is an energy analyst and project officer at WWF South Africa. He has written extensively on sustainable aviation fuel, amongst other things, and is currently pursuing a PhD in chemical engineering. Hiten Palmer is the director of South Africa's National Electric Mobility Program, the Uyilo Electric Mobility Program. He is a thought leader and industry expert with over 15 years of industry experience. Dave Wright spent 23 years at Engen and then worked as a special advisor to the CEO of Engen Limited. He is currently providing independent advice on energy matters, particularly related to oil and gas, and is on the board of the South African National Energy Association. Gaylor Montmaison-Claire is a senior economist focusing on sustainable growth at TIPS. He has written extensively on the transition to the green economy from a developing country perspective, including extensively on the impacts of a transition to electric vehicles in South Africa, and recently on how to avoid the risk of this transition, focusing only on benefits for elites. Dave Collins is a chemical engineer and an independent decarbonization advisor. He was integral to preparing the report that will be released as part of this project, and which he will shortly discuss. And in that report, we have really brought together all of the latest research and modeling that has been done on decarbonization pathways for the transport sector. So once again, thank you for joining us. We look forward to the discussion, and I will hand over to you, Dave. Thanks very much. Unmute, Dave.
Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, everyone from sunny Sandton. 35 degrees here today. I'm wearing shorts. It's nice to see so many colleagues in the audience. A lot of you have contributed to this work, and let's just very quickly cover what is in this. We're presenting information for the financial sector. We're giving you overviews of technology options and some associated ESG risks. We've reviewed all the sources that we can find in the country, and this is the first report that is actually comprehensive, that has covered every sector in the country. And the overall conclusion from all of this work is that we can decarbonize transport by 2050. The big things are on land-based transport, as Tracy mentioned, 91% of the emissions are from land. We got a shift from road to rail. We've got to get passengers away from cars to public transport. And the big one, of course, is we have to electrify transport, ultimately with decarbonized electricity. Shipping is less than 1%. It's not really a priority at this stage. And aviation is about 8%. And there's some very interesting developments there on sustainable aviation fuel, as well as thoughts for batteries and hydrogen for shorter flights. There's big implications of everything ahead. We're going to need more renewable electricity capacity. The volume of liquid fossil fuel is going to plummet. We're not going to need any more fuel refining capacity. And then finally, just to stress that we are focusing here on what shift measures. We're shifting from private vehicles to public transport. We're shifting on things like energy efficiency, design, shifting to electric vehicles. We're not considering at this point avoid measures, which is things like city design, redesigning cities. That is a much, much bigger subject that we are not tackling at this point. And finally, we're having a very limited focus on rail measures, even though they are important. Why limited? Because while we do have some good ideas as to what needs to be done, we are a long way from getting any kind of government intention or policy on this. And as you all know, the whole rail system is a bit of a mess. So we have good analyses of what needs to be done, but there is no real action or planning. So there's very little going to be said about rail today. So having said that, what we'd like to do is just ask our panelists to give 2 or 3 minutes of thoughts on what they think the big picture looks like What are the problems? What's holding us back? What we should be doing? And then we're going to ask you as the audience straight after that on a poll to ask you, what do you think is preventing the transport sector from making a rapid transition? So let's kick off at random with Gaylor. Gaylor, just give us a couple of minutes of your thoughts as to what do you think is holding us back? What do we need to do?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure to take part in the discussion today. I think, you know, from my perspective, certainly, the priority should be to have a people-centered transport future and our transport system in the reality of people on a daily basis. At the moment, I think there's a bit of a disjuncture between what some of us are used to and experience and what the reality of most people in the country. You know, if we look at actual main travel modes, walking is number one in the country. By far. Then it is taxis, minibus taxis. Third, cars, and then buses very far. I'm not even talking about rail, very, very far away. So most people actually still walk today, not by choice, by default. You know? Only a third of households can afford to have a private vehicle. And you have more than 2/3 of the poorest household in the country that spend more than 20% of their income on transport per month. 20%. Imagine, for all of us in this room, spending 20% of what you earn on transport per month. It's massive, you know. We also tend to forget the very long travel time that a lot of people experience. You know, the average travel time for people who walk is 30 minutes, but people who take minibus taxi is 63 minutes. Buses is 84. On train is 107 in the country. 107 minutes. So, you know, for me, what I look forward to in the future is transport system that answer people's needs. You know, and that is we need a holistic approach. We need a really holistic approach. It's not about one small fix here and there. I'm gonna improve that vehicle or improve that little, you know, bus line or whatever. We need a really holistic approach. We need to put our money where it matters. For now, we have a very skewed incentive system that really is not targeted at the bulk of the people. And it has to come with spatial development. Redefining space is critical, you know, particularly, of course, in urban areas, but in rural areas, we need to bring mobility. We need to bring transport. It's not there. You know? So, you know, it's also, in closing, you know, important to realize why people move. And I was quite surprised when I was checking the stats, actually. First is education, by far. Education is the primary reason why people actually move in South Africa. Then it is work, and only third is going to the shops. All right. So if we understand why people move, what matters to them, which is travel time, cost, and flexibility, then we can design a system that actually is centered on people. And that is affordable, convenient, and of course, sustainable going forward. So that's, you know, for me, what I'm looking forward to the future. But that means going back to understanding the reality of the bulk of people on the ground. And that's a picture that we often forget.
Thank you, Gaylor, for that big picture comment. Dave, would you like to comment? The other Dave?
Thanks very much, Dave, and thank you very much to Just Share, WWF, NBI, and Lewis Foundation for inviting me onto the panel. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Gelo, a hard act to follow, man. I mean, you really have hit the nail on the head. But just to add to what you said, I mean, obviously the future in transport is electric, generated renewably. We're looking for efficiency in public transport and affordability. And of course, goods must get off the road and onto rail. And although we aren't going to talk too much about rail, that move is absolutely critical. When one stands back, and Tracy mentioned in her introduction, there's not been a lot of attention on transport and the transformation or transition that's required. And the reason I think is that, Eskom and coal have just dominated the whole transition thinking and conversation. And essentially, in my opinion, people just take having fuel as for granted until, of course, it's not there. So, airplanes are flying out of Cape Town right now are not very happy because they're not getting the jet fuel. And as soon as there's no fuel and people have to start queuing to fill up, then it becomes a crisis. And I think people don't realize just how critically important at the moment liquid fuel is to transportation in the country. And then, as Tracy said, the impact that it has on emissions. What's holding us back in the transition? Well, quite frankly, I think the NOMSA article in the Business Day today hit the nail on the head as well. It's government dithering. And, quite frankly, we need to have, as Gaylor said, a holistic approach to this. And notwithstanding the fact that we have a green transport policy, it doesn't seem to have had any effect on anybody. And, we continually have this lack of coordinated approach at government level. There's the DTRC who think that the auto industry system is the best thing since sliced bread. Now, as Tracy's mentioned in her introduction, that could just go out the window when we can't export anymore. So, yeah, I think we've got a tough job ahead of us. It's something we're going to have to do. And the linchpin in all of this is what our government wants and what our government is able to do. Because they're, to me, at the center of everything. And until we get action out of government and clear direction on where we ought to go, I'm afraid that this whole thing's going to just be stagnant as it is. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much, Dave. Farai, and then Hitchin, and then me. Farai, please.
Thank you very much, Dave, and good afternoon to all our panelists. What I really want to put across here is around the emissions from the air travel sector, which Dave mentioned are about 8% of the total transport emissions. What we do know, what everyone knows, is that air travel is really critical to trade and tourism. So, the global average is about 40% of value, or 40% by value of goods are transported by air. And this is the number for South Africa as well. We've heard about the impact of Europe's carbon border mechanism during Tracy's introduction. A critical element that often gets overlooked is around the transport-related emissions when we export our goods. So we typically tend to focus on the production and the emissions associated with it. But there is an issue around the emissions during transport, and those needs to be addressed. So ideally, in an ideal transport future for aviation, we're talking about good connectivity or airline networks, availability or affordability of air travel. And this is often linked to the price of your fuel in this case. I also want to think about reliability. And this brings into question the jet fuel security that Dave Collins mentioned earlier. So, you come to the airport and then your airline is, or your flight is not going because there isn't security of, there isn't any jet fuel at the airport. So that's also quite important. And then critically, I think it's quite important, as I've mentioned before, to decarbonize the industry from a trade perspective, to increase South Africa's, the competitiveness of South African goods. And also another thing, if you look at the tourism aspect, long-haul tourism to be specific, the Presidential Climate Commission has highlighted in their Just Transition framework that long-haul tourism is going to be affected as more and more travels become climate conscious. So we really need to make travel to South Africa quite sustainable. And in all this, I think it brings light into the attention that needs to come to aviation. Traditionally, because aviation it was looked upon as contributing to only a few of the emissions, and certainly in the South African case, it is almost a kind of niche market because not a large part of the population uses air travel. But the consequences are high, and we would really need to look at how we go about decarbonizing this space. And another big thing that I think that needs to be looked at is, why are we not moving towards transforming this industry? I think there's generally a lack of understanding of the solutions that are available, what could be done. And I think that needs to be shared around, and that understanding needs to filter through the different levels of society and government, so that we all move towards one purpose and one goal. And having said all this, government's role is quite critical to come up with a strong vision for policy towards decarbonizing aviation. And what has been highlighted or shown through various research is that sustainable aviation fuels, which is an alternative jet fuel, is a critical component of decarbonizing this sector. So we really need to look at how can we move towards producing this locally, and what are the benefits that could come out of doing this. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Farai. Hiten, could you please comment?
Yeah, thank you, Dave, and good afternoon to everybody, fellow panelists and the host today. It's a pleasure to join you on this very interesting topic and relative, also as Tracy introduced, within National Transport Month. Just on the electric vehicles journey in South Africa, if we look back, hybrid electric vehicles were introduced in 2005. Battery electric vehicles in 2013, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in 2015. But today, as where we stand, as of June this year, there were less than 2,000 plug-in electric vehicles available in the country, out of the close to 12 million vehicles on our car park. So it's really nothing to be proud of from that perspective. Certainly that framework is hindered in South Africa's context around the affordability of vehicles. This on the bank of the tax regime in South Africa to guide and drive the local manufacturing economy. When we look at that in the automotive space and new energy vehicles landscape, the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle for Mercedes-Benz only was established from a manufacturing in 2018. And then Toyota announced in 2021 of the hybrid electric vehicle Corolla. So, looking at both lenses, we have nothing to show from electric vehicle stance from that. This is really where we need to transform South Africa's landscape. One is looking at what are the barriers to entry in driving the market uptake, but more importantly, is driving our manufacturing sector. And I think that's what's going to be driving economic growth, job creation, market access, not only to maintain our current markets, but to grow that. The 2035 Automotive Master Plan aims to, for South Africa to reach 1% of global production, and EVs in this major transition, EVs are certainly in that. But where are we today? We are still lagging behind from an incentivization for manufacturing in terms of that. So, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There has been work happening, but we certainly need to move a lot faster. Looking at the energy crisis, I think load shedding is one topic that's never ever mentioned when you speak about EVs. But when we look at the different aspect on that, as much as it's created a major disruption into the residential space and commercial and industrial space, it's actually what drove the acceleration of deployment of renewables and storage in the South African landscape. In 2021, South Africa was ranked 6th globally in residential energy storage market. That's just on the bank of load shedding. So when you look at it holistically, we've got an ideal environment, as much as it's a bit of a conundrum to solve. We've had increased deployment of renewables onto the network, but we're in this transitional phase now that we're seeing that it's an ideal phase now to take the next bold move going forward for South Africa in terms of that. So I'll stop there from just scene setting and look forward to the following engagements.
Thank you, Hiten. Thank you, everyone. So we're hearing there people's needs from Gaylor, government lack of policy, lack of vision, aviation, the importance and general understanding by people of what's going on, and then Hiten on the automotive sector. So now we're going to go to a poll. We're going to ask you, if we could bring that up, please. What do you think is preventing the sector, the transportation sector, from making a rapid transition? Can we pull up the questions on the screen? So choose one of these, please, just one single choice. What's the main obstacle to a successful transport sector transition? And I've never worked out, should one say Thomas or Timaeus? But you know what the meaning is. So please choose one. And sorry, panelists, you cannot vote. Everybody been able to choose one? I think NBI technical people in the background, are you able to give us at least a 90% poll vote on that? Or do you need a bit of time still?
About 97 participants have
That's cool.
answered.
That's 75%. So let's try that. See how it looks. The one that springs out for me is that the technology is available because it's a very low vote. That's very interesting, and I would agree with that. Everything's in place except financing. Obviously, the financiers are going to disagree with that, so good. So we're all raring to go with technology and finance, but we don't have, the big one is we don't have that supporting government vision and policy, and that seems to make a lot of sense, because at least two of you have mentioned that in your talks there. Vested interest holding it back to some degree, 25%, 23%, and then a lack of understanding is also a bit of a problem. But the big one is government, and the two issues that we do not have are technology and financing. That's pretty clear. Thank you very much, everyone, for that. So if we could close that now, I'm going to take one or two questions. Nothing much has, let me just look at these questions. Okay, I'm going to take one here. Building on Gaylor's thought-provoking introduction, given the urgent need for a systemic approach, a holistic approach. Yeah, that's what Gaylor was arguing. We need a much bigger holistic approach. Staying in the improve aspect, in other words, e-mobility, might lock us into unsustainable approaches. Gaylor, can you see this question?
Yeah, I'm just reading it as you.
Okay,
as you
I'm just reading it out for the audience. If we just go to improve things, which is really the technology, it may well lock in unsustainable approaches. And we'll be locked in for 30 to 40 years. So carry on with that question, Gaylor, and just comment on that. Are we in danger of locking in to some approaches for 30 to 40 years?
Well, I think what's certain is that, you know, a purely technology-driven approach is doomed to fail. You know, that's quite clear. That's clear in transport, but I think that's not specific to it. Interestingly, you know, the main framework to think about
Gaylor, sorry, you were.
transition of the transport sector looks at avoid, shift, and
Gaylor, you are tripping in and out again. You were okay at the end of your last session, but you're now a little bit of a. You want to turn your camera off and see if that helps?
sure, let's see. Hopefully that gets better.
That seems to be better. Yes, thank you.
Sorry about that.
Okay, carry on.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that, you know, the leading kind of way of thinking about transitioning transport globally is really around a triple framework of avoid, shift, and improve. And I think certainly if we focus only on improve, which is improving the efficiency of vehicles and moving to alternative fuels, and we're doomed to fail. There's always going to be a need for vehicles. So of course it's an important component, but avoid, which is about addressing our spatial planning and reducing the need to use private vehicle, should really be at the core. But it also should include a component of bringing better transportation and mobility to people. As I said, many people don't have access to mobility. So, you know, when we're thinking about shifting, it's really about bringing the opportunity to use public transport, to have access to non-motorized transport, which generally means a very different spatial development framework. So I would 100% agree that we can't be technology focused. Technology is a key component and it shouldn't be neglected, but it's not the silver bullet. And I think sometimes we make it like it's going to solve our problems, whereas we need that much more holistic approach to mobility overall going forward.
Thank you, Gaylor, and thank you to Gordon Lang for that question. Gordon was one of the contributors to the input to this work. Yeah, we must be very careful, as Gaylor says, not to just focus on the technology. Now, we did say at the beginning that we are not putting much on avoid measures in this report. It's such a huge subject and it is not well developed in South Africa, whereas a lot of the improved measures are becoming quite well developed. So maybe there's a danger sign there. Avoid measures are quite complex, require lots of thought, lots of redesign, lots of capital. The improved measures are so much more obvious and easy to comprehend. We're possibly in danger then of going too much into the improve and not into the avoid. Any quick comments from the panel on that before we go to the next section?
Dave, I would just say that if we're going to just go the improve route, it's going to effectively not address any of the social issues, because we're going to replace current old with new, and it won't change the social setup at all. So, you know, Gaylor's point about focusing on the avoid, which are the tough things, is where we have to go.
Thank you, Dave. So that's very much in keeping with what Gaylor said, a very important point. I'm now going to move into next section, where I'm going to ask each of the panelists for 3 or 4 minutes, even if they've timed it for 5 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes to just talk about where they might see some of the opportunities and the threats of this transition. We've already touched on some of these. I'm going to do in a bit of an order here. I'm going to kick off with EVs and first ask Gaylor to say a bit more about how he sees EVs, the value chain, this problem with elites being able to afford them, but nobody else can. And then I'm going to ask Hiten to talk about the development of the EV infrastructure and domestic solar and charging charging combinations, etc. And then we move, I'll just do a quick bit about the electricity required for EVs. We talk a bit about the demise of fossil fuels. We'll talk a bit about the workers who are at risk from the transition, the change, talk a bit about hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel, and then a bit about what is Sasol's future in the light of all these developments. But if I could ask Gaylord to kick off with some thoughts on the value chain, pricing, and etc. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, David. Hopefully you can all hear me okay.
Yes, that sounds good.
I think we are at great danger of having the EV transition leaving many, if not most, behind. And by that, it's most countries, but even within South Africa, it's most people. And I think it's really important that we apply our mind to how to have an inclusive rollout of electric vehicles, not simply because it sounds like it's the right thing to do, but because actually it is really about keeping the entire sector alive. And I think there's two ways to think about it. The first one, not surprisingly, is to focus on public transport, and bring mobility and e-mobility in public transport. This is what people use. They use minibus taxis and to a lesser extent, buses. So, I said 3/4 of the people in South Africa rely on public transport, and out of that, about 2/3 rely on minibus taxis. So if we're serious about an inclusive rollout, we need to bring minibus taxis. There's some pilots going on into the country, which is really exciting. There's a pilot going on that's going to start now in Stellenbosch with the minibus taxi industry. And I think it's really exciting because it's going to show, I think that it's the way to go. Of course, there's lots of small problems to iron out in the process, and I think that's going to help us to do that. And if we want to ramp that up very quickly, we can support it from a policy perspective. We already have a mechanism, which is called the Taxi Recapitalization Program, where we incentivize taxi owners to bring new vehicles on the road. Well, we can use that vehicle to incentivize the industry to bring e-minibus taxis, be it hybrids or full batteries. And in the bus side, it falls into the municipalities mostly. And here we can also do quite a lot to bring new business model, support the procurement of buses. Here as well, there's a pilot starting in the country. It was very exciting. A few municipalities are starting to look at that seriously. It's a bit more difficult from a charging perspective, and there's some technical issues to be sorted out. And I think that's what we need. We need that pilot to sort it out properly. But of course, look, despite everything I've said before, we can't neglect the private vehicle side of things. We can't neglect it because 2 out of 3 of the vehicles that are produced in South Africa end up on the domestic market. About 3 out of 5 end up being exported to Europe. So if we're serious about saving our manufacturing going forward, which for now virtually only manufactures internal combustion engine vehicles, we need to keep up with the transition. Like Tracy in her introduction, highlighted to the markets transitioning. Export markets are transitioning very rapidly. We're gonna have to start producing EVs for export, but we also can't afford to have a domestic market that's completely disjointed. And here that means really supporting the market for entry-level electric vehicles. Entry-level, What is entry-level in South Africa? Entry level in South Africa is any vehicle that is sold under 260,000 Rand. This is the entry level market segment. That's roughly 50% of the market. All right. We don't have a single electric vehicle in South Africa that you can buy for that price tag. All right. So we need to have a serious conversation about how do we bring entry level vehicles into the country, not the luxury ones. There's always going to be a market for luxury ones, but about the big ones, the entry vehicle. And here, I think we need some support mechanism. We've been doing some work looking at what's possible, either using grant system, interest rates. The idea is just to reduce the upfront cost, because of course, as we know, it's already much cheaper to run. So we want to reduce the upfront cost. It's actually quite easily doable for that particular market segment. There's some accompanying measures that we can take. Of course, let's reduce the tariff for the import of some of those vehicles and so forth. But the key is really to focus on that market segment. We again tend to forget that this is the bulk of the market. 260,000 Rand is half the market and below. So that's for me, critical. It's critical for us to have an inclusive rollout, but it's also critical to maintain the viability of our manufacturing industry and the value chain associated with that. I'll get into that a bit later. But I mean, for now, I think that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaylor. I think the financial people that are present with us, I hope you're finding the uncertainties that these pictures that we're painting. It's not all about hard numbers and about numbers of vehicles and numbers of financing opportunities. It's really about explaining all the things that have to be done to make this transition work. Could we hand over to Hiten? Could you just give us some thoughts on how you see the EV infrastructure system developing?
Yep, thanks, Dave. So I think, from an infrastructure point of view, and I think just one of the points just to highlight from that there was an early analysis done that, on this transition framework. So one of the biggest contributors to South Africa's transport emissions is on fuel quality. South Africa's bulk fuel quality is still at Euro 2, where international markets are at Euro 5 and Euro 6. And if we had to transition in terms of this from Euro 2 to Euro 6, it'll only provide a 12% saving on greenhouse gas emissions. So just in context to that, over and above the infrastructure upgrades that needs to be done. However, just from the introduction I mentioned about, we've had a mass deployment of solar and renewable energy onto our grid network on the bank of load shedding. So in most cases, you find major businesses. I think the chat also referenced Golden Arrow bus services in Cape Town doing their pilot where they have rooftop solar and now transitioning into pilot of the electric buses with, scaling up from that with positive returns on those investments in terms of that. So we're seeing this transition now that's coming into play where both the energy and the transport sector is providing an opportunity of sector coupling. And once we move into the new energy framework, we're seeing, solar storage and EVs really fit in well into that mechanism, not only from a technical perspective, you've got the total cost of ownership benefit out of that, and as well as the financing mechanisms when you look at that full portfolio. What's important to note that, electric mobility provides the productive use of energy in that total investment framework, even from a return on investment from that perspective. In most cases, just the solar and storage solutions match the, commercial or residential energy usage. But once you latch on mobility onto that, it's an interesting case from that perspective. We're also seeing a financing solutions coming into play that's a full end-to-end solution in terms of that. So even from a developer perspective, they, once they're investing into the solar and storage solution, they're interested to put the charging infrastructure down and also now to finance, most importantly, the fleets. And that's where it is. I know one of the conundrums at this stage is the supply of vehicles, and that's where we're trying to transition at this stage. Part of the work now that should be coming out is how to incentivize production, on that framework. On the earlier introductions given, South Africa's manufacturing industry started in 1924, and to what it is today, pre-COVID, close to 7% contribution to national GDP. That's on the bank of the production incentive program. However, the shortfall of that there hasn't been any incentive over and above fossil fuel technologies to incentivize the transition of green component manufacturing. And I think this is where it is. So this is part of the leverage now. And Minister Patel has specifically spoken about this. Are we going to transition and, more importantly, incentivize the OEMs and the global manufacturing community to incentivize production from that perspective? What's important to note as well is that South Africa's charging infrastructure landscape is currently on a positive footprint for the car park we have at the moment. That's the important aspect to note. Internationally, you're looking at ratios of maybe 20 vehicles to one charging station, whereas in South Africa, we're at a ratio of 8. So it's a positive footprint that we have in terms of that. Most importantly, knowing as well is that in the personal mobility space, 80% of charging actually takes place at home while you're sleeping. So, those are the key points to look at from an infrastructure point of view, and where we are in terms of that. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Hidden. Okay, I'd like to throw in a couple of comments about sector coupling, and that's really to say, if you think about it, today we've got two energy systems. One is liquid fuels and cars and mobility. Liquid fuels for mobility, yep, and cars. And the other one is electricity, and they're quite separate. And as I'm sure you're well aware, that's all going to come together as electrification proceeds. Everything's going to come together. So we could have batteries sitting idle during the day, being able to store energy during the day from solar PV, and then they could discharge back into the grid at night. We could have solar farms producing excess electricity during the day, being used to make hydrogen, electrolysis of water, and then being used to make fuels and synthetic fuels and chemicals from that surplus energy. All going to be facilitated by digital control, dynamic time of use pricing, all kinds of management interventions. And as the head of Honda said recently, transport will increasingly become electricity plus smart communications. So we have a global paradigm shift ahead of us, away from a fossil fuel-based system with these two separate subsystems to a single situation that uses a lot of solar and wind, and with balancing technologies such as batteries. And my view and my impression is, having worked a lot in both electricity and transport, that electricity is, 3 years ahead of transport in the transition. Everybody now knows what has to be done, even though there are roadblocks ahead. But I don't think everybody knows what has to be done in transport. And as Gaylor has eloquently described as a much bigger additional dimension to the transport, making electric vehicles accessible to everybody. In terms of just a couple of numbers to throw in, just to put everything in perspective, all the work that we've looked at, all the publications show that to decarbonize South Africa by 2050, we need about 150 gigawatts of solar and wind, about 5 gigawatts per annum until 2050. 150 gigawatts in total, with several hundred billion rands worth of investment in generation and grid capacity. 150 gigawatts. The transport sector, it looks like, looking at all the work that's been done, is going to need an additional 30 to 40 gigawatts of capacity, of generation capacity, of solar and wind. And again, of course, they'll have their own batteries. So we're looking at an effort that's probably another ballpark, another third on top of what's already been said that is necessary for electricity. Going to ask now, just shift gear a bit and ask Dave Wright to comment on what do you think the impact of all these global and hopefully local shifts are going to be on fossil fuels?
Thanks, Dave. I think, to start off with, just to put it into context, and I'm quoting 2019 figures here because pre-COVID is probably a reasonable reflection of the industry. But at that point, it was the industry, the liquid fuels industry, was contributing 3% to GDP. And to put it into context, auto industry in the same year was about 6.5. In addition, the number of people employed, both direct and indirect, is about 250,000. And of those, the direct jobs are about 170,000, which when you look at it from an employment point of view and compare it with the figures that Tracy gave us earlier of 110 in auto and 95 in coal, suggests that the people side of the transition in liquid fuels is something which up to now has essentially been neglected by and large, but it does need some attention, especially if you consider that about half of the 170,000 are petrol attendants on forecourts. And I'm sure Gaylor was going to touch on that shortly. So, in simple terms, what is the impact going to have? Well, it's going to take a chunk of jobs out, and it's going to take a chunk of GDP out. No doubt what will happen is new industries will fill the gap. And obviously, if we can get the just transition correct, then the 250,000 jobs that are in the industry will be replaced in some of the new industries, and the transition will have then been effective. But I think the point that everybody needs to stop and reflect on is that this demise that everybody talks about for liquid fuels is not an instantaneous thing. It's going to take time. If you take the NBI study, they said that electric vehicles are only going to start impacting from about 2035. And that's another 12, 13 years ahead. And the other thing you've got to remember is that the internal combustion engine vehicle fleet in the car park, the average age is between 12 and 15 years. So we're not going to see cars disappearing off the roads at a great rate of knots. And we're not going to see petrol stations disappearing rapidly. It's going to happen over 10 to 20 years, I reckon. And looking forward, based on the current mobility angle from an electricity point of view, it looks like passenger vehicles are leading the race compared to commercial vehicles, which then suggests that we will see petrol demand fall off faster than diesel demand. So, from a liquid fuels perspective, I think there's going to still be lots of liquid fuel around for at least the next 20 years. Most of it will be diesel, but we'll start to see petrol falling off. And part of the reason that we're seeing some of the refineries in the country closing down is mainly a result of the economic situation in recent times, but they're also looking ahead to the future, because a refinery has a particular product mix which it is designed to produce. So it becomes very inflexible as the product demand slate changes. So if you shift to a import mode, you can actually match your imports to your demand. So we're going to see a change in the liquid fuel industry for sure. And yes, the demand will drop as electric vehicles enter the market, but it's not going to be a quick thing. We're going to see petrol stations around for a long time. So yeah, losing the jobs is not going to be a major catastrophe, but we better plan for it. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. I'm just going to put on into the parking lot, forgive the pun, the impact on petrol attendants, etc., people who don't transition. Put that aside for a moment, just in the interest of time. I'm going to ask again change gear a bit and ask Farai to talk about a little bit about green hydrogen, how he sees green hydrogen developing with particular reference to sustainable aviation fuel.
Thanks, Dave. I think green hydrogen is going to be quite key in the transition. I think before we get to sustainable aviation fuels, we have seen recent developments in South Africa, particularly around using green hydrogen in mining trucks, with some of the big mining houses starting to move into that direction. So there's possibly a big role that green hydrogen could play in this space. When it comes to sustainable aviation fuel, I think it's important to put it out there that it is still a liquid fuel, which has the similar characteristics to your conventional jet fuel. So what that means is it is essentially made up of a carbon atom and hydrogen as well. So what we've seen with some work is hydrogen is an essential feedstock for producing sustainable aviation fuels. For the modeling that we as WWF did, we've seen an almost 70% increase in sustainable aviation fuel production if you were to include green hydrogen in addition to your carbon source. So that's got a big role for hydrogen in that case. And essentially producing sustainable aviation fuel industry could provide a hydrogen sink. I know the country as a whole is moving towards, developing hydrogen valleys and looking for possible outtackers. So creating a local SAF production facilities would create local demand and add, value addition instead of just exporting it out overseas. So I think that's a great opportunity that the country needs to look at.
Thank you, Farai. And then Dave, could you just close out with maybe asking you, what are your thoughts on what this means for a huge company like Sasol? A foot in the past, a foot in the future.
Now, David, you've seen Sasol have already acknowledged publicly that green hydrogen is going to be very much part of their future. They've realized that being coal-fed is not going to help them be part of the future. And their expertise and knowledge of working with hydrogen from their current operations puts them in a very good position to be bulk producers of green hydrogen, provided they can get the electricity, and the whole value chain then becomes economical. But I think from a South African point of view, we ought to be hoping like mad that Sasol does have a future, because they are critical to the chemical industry in the country. Plastics, fertilizer, explosives, all the feedstocks are coming out of the Sasol system. Now, the big problem that Sasol will have in the future is not the green hydrogen, because that technology exists. The big problem is going to be, where do you get the renewable source of carbon atoms? And Farai has indicated that's a big challenge. And that's going to always be, how on earth do you get carbon atoms into the system that you can replace? So I'm sure Sasol will have a future. They've said it's going to focus on green hydrogen. Just how they manage the carbon atom side of things, I don't know, but I'm sure they'll have a solution.
Yeah, and of course, Dave, there is a solution in the sense that you've got direct air capture, but at enormous expense at this stage. That's the problem, isn't it?
Well, there's lots of solutions, Dave, but they're all very expensive. I mean, direct air capture is one of them. Biomass feed is another. But, the energy density of all the alternative carbon sources, renewable carbon sources, tends to be very low. And as a consequence, the costs go up and the efficiency drops.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to move to another poll and then take some questions. One question I'd just like everyone to think about in the meantime is from Jessica DeBrain. And that's really, what do we see? The one thing we haven't really covered in this discussion, because we haven't done that much work on it. What are your thoughts and ideas on the shift from road to rail? How are we going to achieve that? Everyone's saying it has to be done. It's all been quantified, the need for it. But with the problems with Transnet and Prasa, how do you think this might happen? So think about that. And in the meantime, the second question is, do you think South Africa can get its act together and achieve a TIMUS or TIMIUS local transport sector transition? Can we transition the sector? One choice, please, from definitely yes down to definitely not. And let's see if we can crack the 75% participation this time, which we had 75 last time. How are we doing NBI? Are we up at 90 or so yet?
We're at 83%.
Okay, 7 more and then we'll take it. Are we there?
84. I
Okay,
think we
let's
can stop it.
let's do it. See what we say.
Dave, just while those results are coming up, we've got lots of really interesting questions. I think we need to, I know you're going to spend some time focusing on those afterwards, but just in case you haven't been able to see that while you've been speaking.
Yep, I've seen some of them. Thank you, Tracy. Yes. So the weighted average, can we get our act together and achieve the transition? The weighted average is sort of slightly below maybe. Yeah. It's just slightly less pessimistic than maybe. And I guess that's for all the reasons we've discussed. So let's move on from that and let's now take questions in our remaining, going to take about 10-15 minutes to discuss some of these great questions, and then we'll hand over to Tracy to wrap up and any closing comments. But the one I just wanted to ask you, would anyone like to take the question about how do we see this transition from road to rail? How feasible is that in the circumstances? Anyone like to take that one? Before I volunteer somebody?
Dave, my solution is privatize. You know, there isn't a single SOC that has been successful, and keeping the rail in government hands is just going to make it worse. So stop the government involvement, privatize it, and let's see what happens.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay.
I think, yeah, just to add to that, you know, under the green transport strategy, one of the pillar frameworks is to transition, you know, commercial goods transport from road to rail in managing emissions. But, you know, how that is implemented is a bigger question around that. But just to give reference that it is one of the frameworks that Department of Transport aim to manage emissions from, you know, heavy commercial vehicles currently, you know, transporting goods in that framework onto rail.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I'm taking two from Lindy van Hasselt. One is, maybe I can answer. Well, let me put them both up. One is, what about e-scooters, e-motorbikes? Hitting any views on that? And then the other question from Lindy is a very good one. If the lack of government vision is key, how do we at best engage? We don't have anyone from the current automotive sector present, and they're in the thick of it at present. But any thoughts on that second question? How do we best engage with government? And while you're thinking, could I ask, isn't e-scooters, e-motorbikes, is anything happening on that?
Yeah, I was busy typing a response, but yeah, certainly. So I think what's important to note that in every market, there's a different environment from that perspective. East Africa has got a thriving industry at the moment of transitioning two-wheelers into electric. If you look at most of the public transport means within East African countries, it's the borders and those sort of solutions, which is the two-wheelers. You can even book an e-hailing service on a two-wheeler, in that environment. So there's a lot of investments, there's a lot of projects, accelerations of two-wheeler solutions in those specific markets. You have the options of the battery swap model, leasing the mobility platform. So that's how all of that is all merging in there. However, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not the case. There's been a number of analysis in that perspective. The mode of, the two-wheeler mode of transport is not as active as we see in Europe as well in micromobility solutions, and what we see in East Africa. Possibly, the regional closeness to Europe has had that infiltration there. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it's really, the minibus taxi and private, ownership in terms of that. Even buses, I think South Africa's got most of the higher fleets in terms of public transport for bus, in terms of that. So it's a regional approach from that perspective. Not to say that there's no solutions here, but again, when you're looking at, bridging that social component into it, there is a different uptake or an interest or usage from a social perspective in the local region. But certainly in East Africa, that's an active market in there. And just coming into engaging with government. So, with every government department, there's the leads that are responsible for the green energy transition as well as electric mobility. And engaging with them in those specific leads, you would be linked into the various networks and coordination of activities where they're doing the stakeholder engagements in that sort of framework. So yeah, just a brief comment in terms of that. I think there's a lot that happens in consultation, and it's probably we do too much of that in South Africa and not much implementation, but it is the nature of our environment and the relative consultations happening within those various leads in each department.
Any other thoughts from the panelists on engaging with government, getting this thing moving forward in any particular sector?
Yeah, I can come in there, Dave, from the aviation perspective. I think a critical point is not to look at it as a transport solution only. I mean, government is usually broadly thinking around other factors such as just transition, poverty, employment, and how do we deal with those. So, quite looking at the socio-economic aspects of it, of developing these new green industries and what is possible and what could be done. And we've seen that from a sustainable aviation fuel perspective. There are quite a lot of socioeconomic and ecological benefits that pursuing this industry would bring. So we are talking about over 90,000 plus green jobs in agriculture, looking at transport jobs in the trucking sector, which could potentially offset the co-truckers affected by the transition. I mean, we're talking about export opportunities of the sustainable aviation fuel, which would have great positive impact on our balance of trade. So really, I think these opportunities need to come to the front. And then the second thing I would say is to have a collective voice coming out in front of government instead of having different sectors and everybody saying one thing. I think it'll be quite good to have industry coming forward to support this, to take these opportunities forward. And then, the last thing to put in the third point is around, when it comes to sustainable aviation fuels, the high cost is usually a big barrier. Domestically, I mean, there is a carbon tax liability for aviation, but it's cheaper to pay off that tax than to invest in sustainable aviation fuel. So I mean, over time, a higher carbon tax or higher carbon price would help to propel and get uptake of these technologies locally. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Farai. Gaylor, you'd like to say something? You had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the engagement going forward. I think we need to raise the profile of the issue quite dramatically, and that means more people need to get involved. It's no surprise that at the moment, the bulk of the discussion is on private vehicles and the transition from private vehicles that are ICE to EVs. Why is that? Because the only stakeholder that's pushing for transition is the automotive industry at this point in time. You know, it's in their interest. Okay, for them, they move to produce EVs or they die. It's a very simple equation to solve. So of course, it's in their interest, they're pushing. So it's no surprise that the current debate is only on this. If we want a broader debate, then we need more people to get involved and to see that from different perspectives. So I think it's really welcome, of course, the dialogue that we're having today, you know, but we need to really broaden the perspectives. Otherwise, it's always going to remain a debate that's going to be ICE to EV, period, and nothing else. And I think that's, you know, that we need to understand the dynamics at play here. So I think let's get in the debate from different sides, a bigger side of more people involved, and then we'll have a more comprehensive answer going forward.
Gaynor, I was going to ask you to address a question from Richard Worthington, which is related to what you've already said. And Richard has said that given our socioeconomic conditions, we need a people-centered approach, addressing public transport as a public good, societal benefits. And then he asks, is public transport getting short shrift because it doesn't offer profit opportunities for the private sector? And I think also related to that, could you, you know, electricity is well advanced now with a just transition office at Eskom, and everyone's talking just transition in Mpumalanga. Transport doesn't seem to have that. How can we build up momentum in the just transition aspects of transport, getting it up to where electricity is?
Yeah, so two different questions, but I mean, certainly, I think, you know, public transport is not getting the attention that it deserves, and when it does, we put our money into moving a very limited number of relatively wealthy people. So, you know, I think there's not like there's no money going to public transport into the country. There is, but it's not necessarily going to where it needs to go. You know, and I think that's part of the problem. But of course, more broadly, you know, we should be putting a lot more emphasis into building our public transport. The private sector has a role to play in that, you know, historically in South Africa, and we shouldn't put that aside at all. But again, it's about, you know, how do you build a more comprehensive system that addresses the needs of the bulk of the population, and, you know, not just a few people who need to move from Joburg and Pretoria on a daily basis. So I think that's part of that. In terms of raising the profile from a just transition perspective, you know, well, I think numbers speak for themselves. You know, we have, you know, more than 100,000 people directly employed in the automotive value chain. That's the OEMs and the supply chains, which, if we don't move to EVs, are going to largely disappear. We got 250,000 mechanics in the country, which, if they don't get retrained, reskilled, you know, and accustomed to the new technologies, are at great risk. We have 140,000 people employed in petrol stations. You know, that, of course, there's going to be a long-term transition, but down the line, set to disappear again. Don't need to do great calculation to understand that there's way more people employed than in the coal value chain at this point in time. Yeah. So I think we have an opportunity for this one, not to miss the bus, literally and figuratively. You know, we've missed it already to some extent with the refineries, I think. But that they don't employ too many people, but still. But for the bulk of that transition in transport, we have an opportunity to get it right. You know, and I think that's really the message. You know, often I hear people say, "Oh, it's going to be long term, it's going to be slow, so we don't have to worry about it." No, yeah, it's gonna be a bit long term. It's gonna be a bit slow. Great. Let's get on it now. Let's plan for it. Let's try and get it right. Let's not do what we're doing with the coal value chain, which is too little, too late. So I think that's my message here.
Thank you, Gerard. Before I hand back to Tracy to start closing, I just want to address one question myself, which is from Raksha Dayal, which is there's a growing concern about limited resources like lithium and cobalt and copper, all kinds of things. Absolutely, Raksha, and I think all of us who are reading about this, these visions for 2040 and 2050 are fantastic. We need them, but the grim reality, Mark Kudafani, ex-head of Anglo himself, recently, about a month ago, said, I won't do an Australian accent because you're already listening to my Irish accent. But he said simply, the governments around the world don't get it. There are not enough mines being developed to supply the copper that is required. So I can see tears ahead in terms of supply of critical minerals. Tracy, we have 9 minutes left. I'm going to hand back to you to close off and then maybe to ask for any closing comments.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to the panelists and to what really is an extraordinarily engaged and educated audience. Keeping up with the chat and the questions has been quite fascinating. I think that there are a couple of comments I want to make. The first is just the comment that we try to make whenever we talk about this project anywhere, and that is that not just our project, but in the context of the work that we do at the NBI and at WWF and at Just Share. And that is the magnitude of the renewable energy build-out that we need in this country if we're going to achieve anything, whether it be electricity related, whether it be transport related, whether it be sustainable aviation fuel related. 150 gigawatts of renewable energy for the electricity system, another 30 to 50 gigawatts to electrify the transport sector. And we haven't even started talking about the renewable energy required for green hydrogen, if that's going to play a significant role in the economy. So just want to start with reminding everyone that we should be building 5 to 6, at least, gigawatts of renewable energy every year. We should have started doing that 10 years ago. We're still fighting about all sorts of other irrelevant things, but that is what we should be focusing on from a financing perspective, from a just transition perspective. There are lots of things that are extremely important, but if we don't start building renewable energy at massive magnitude, we're not going to be able to achieve any of these things. Then I think some of the things that have come out in this are, of course, it is, and as Dave and Galo have pointed out very clearly, of course, the automotive sector has the strongest and most important vested interest in transitioning to EVs. Because their export market will literally dry up if they don't. But that's also about, as we've heard, employment for a significant number of people in a variety of value chains. And so there is this external threat that we face that we must address if we're going to successfully transition. But then I think that in a really powerful way, Gaylor has brought home to all of us the human implications, first of all, of our current extraordinarily ineffective, inefficient, and uninclusive transport system in this country, and the opportunities that there are to use this transport sector transition to really address some of those inequities in a very powerful way. We've heard a lot about how little government movement there is in the space and how much more of it we need, but I think we've also seen from what the panelists have said and from what's been said in the chat, that as with everything else, South Africans move with or without government. And there appears to me to be a huge amount of innovation and shifts underway, in this space, which quite frankly, many of which I wasn't even aware of until today. So it's really exciting to see some of those come up. And I think what we really hope that this discussion will spark awareness of in the sector, but also more broadly in the financial sector, is the extent to which the myopic view on coal and the coal value chain in South Africa is really putting at a disadvantage multiple other sectors in our economy, leaving them behind, leaving them out of crucial conversations about decarbonization and the just transition. And I think we are, as a country, suffering from a collective illustration of what's called prospect theory. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept. It's a theory of loss aversion, and what it says is that humans feel losses much more acutely than they feel equivalent gains. And I think we are all clinging on to the past because we are so scared of what we're going to lose when we move away from it, and not thinking nearly enough about the extraordinary opportunities that are inherent in this transition, which everyone here has spoken about today, and which the comments in the chat really point to some exciting stuff. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your interaction and comments. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you to Dave for all your hard work on this project. Thank you to NBI and WWF. This has been a really big and quite overwhelming project for a lot of us at times, but we've learned a huge amount. And now I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to say in the last 5 minutes, just please 1 minute of what you'd like everyone to remember from this conversation. I'll start with you, Dave. Dave Wright, sorry.
Sorry, Dave Wright. Okay, Dave Wright.
You can go last, Dave.
Go on.
But, I think we have to bring the minibus taxi industry into this. They have to be part of the solution going forward. If we leave them out, we're going to have trouble.
Thank you. Farai.
Thank you. I think that we should not continue to sideline the aviation-related emissions. The ramifications of not countering them is really significant, and we should, be aware and take into account all these opportunities that lie before us in this window of opportunity that South Africa has at the moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Farai. Hitim.
The transition is happening, and certainly in the battery electric vehicle space, both on the mobility and infrastructure side, technology solutions are mature, including heavy commercial vehicle applications in battery electric. South Africa will see its first pilot this year in that space. We have the solutions on infrastructure as well as the business models. And then also just closing the loop in final comments, the EU had an interesting analysis for job opportunities across the battery electric vehicle value chain with up to 1 million jobs to be created by 2030. South Africa has its national development plan vision by 2030. Could we join the dots? That's what lies ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Hitim. Gelo.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I think in closing, I would say that, already when we did the vulnerability assessment and the resilience plans back in, I think 2017, 2018, we showed the coal value chain is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our just transition. Next in line, certainly is transport. There is an opportunity to get it right. As Ethan and the others have showed, there are many opportunities in transport, public transport, manufacturing of vehicles and batteries and so forth. It's not too late. So let's get on it now.
Thanks, Gelo. Dave, you may have the last word.
Thank you. I just wanted to say something to the financial people present, the people that were hoping to pitch up and get a spreadsheet of all the quantified opportunities for the next 30 years. A lot of this information is available, and it will be in our report. There is, of course, a huge amount that is not available, like the points that Gaylor talked about the social aspects. It just hasn't really been addressed yet. The rail, as we've said, has not been addressed. But when it comes to EVs, when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel, it is getting much, much more quantified. And it's happening at a global level, and we will be following behind, even if it's 10 years to go, it will be happening. So a lot of information is already available. But as I said, my final comment would be, I think we're at least 3 to 4 years behind where the electricity sector is in understanding its position.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks so much. Thank you all for joining us. And as I say, the report will be released soon, and Just Share and NBI and WWF are available for any further interaction or questions that you may have. Thanks for joining us. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks very much, everyone. Cheerio.